In the Manhattan ballrooms, where glasses chimed like luxury clocks marking the time of the powerful, Alexander discovered a folded piece of paper in his inside jacket pocket. Small, careful writing. I saw what you kept silent. There was no signature, but the discreet scent of the service corridor betrayed Emily, the maid who went unnoticed while polishing crystals and memories. That night, as on so many others, she would leave short notes, pleas for humanity, whispered warnings, truths no one dared to speak, and he would respond with a single weapon: silence. A stare fixed into the distance, a toast without a smile. The more the notes were repeated, the more his silence grew at the long tables, the more his wife felt the ground shift beneath her heels. In her pocket the paper burned. In her chest something gave way. Fate patient began to write its letter. A new note, folded in three, fell like a quill and blade. What we keep silent condemns us. Alexander put the paper away, raised his glass and said nothing. The silence, however, was already a message. Across the table, the millionairess watched his hand touch his jacket with the frequency of a recent habit. The maître d' looked away, the orchestra trembled half a measure, and Emily passed behind the chairs like a shadow noting the world. In the early hours of the morning, a note disappeared from his lapel before he arrived at the office. The next day, rumors sprouted like weeds. Someone was watching, someone was gathering evidence, someone was seeking a scandal. Emily realized too late that her whispers had reached the wrong audience, and her wife decided to secretly fire her. But one last note remained pinned to the lining of his suit. When words fail, karma speaks. It was the announcement that the silence about to explode would change everyone's fate. Stories like this remind us that life is often a stage where injustice seems to prevail, but fate always prepares its response. And if you also believe that nothing remains hidden forever, take this opportunity to further strengthen this space. Like and subscribe to the channel. This way, you can follow every detail of these twists and turns that reveal how karma never fails. The gala ballroom that evening resembled a living painting. Crystal chandeliers cast golden reflections on the impeccable marble, while the orchestra in the background lulled the guests into whispered conversations and calculated laughter. Alexander, the millionaire, sat at the head of the table, impeccably dressed in his dark suit. His austere face and impenetrable silence were hallmarks that made him enigmatic, and his every gesture drew curious glances. To his left, Helena, his wife, stunning in a red dress with a plunging neckline, played hostess with practiced smiles and sharp turns of phrase. It seemed a perfect scene of power and status, but there were cracks few could see. Emily, the young blonde maid, moved discreetly through the hall's corridors. Her short, youthful uniform, with a daring neckline and a hemline above the knees, contrasted with the sophistication of the surroundings, but she carried her tray with firmness and restrained grace. To the guests, she was nothing more than a shadow moving among the glasses and plates, but there was something in her eyes that betrayed hidden secrets, a flame that not even her employer's humiliations had been able to extinguish. That night, when she approached to discreetly remove a plate from the table, Emily left something else. A folded note, deftly placed in Alexander's inside jacket pocket. There was no signature, just short, handwritten words. I saw what you kept quiet about. Her heart raced. She had never dared so much. It was a huge risk. If discovered, she would pay dearly. But she felt she needed to speak, even if silently, and only Alexander would understand. Feeling the paper in his pocket, Alexander held his breath. He didn't react, didn't move a muscle. He raised his wineglass to his lips, feigning indifference, but his heart was beating faster. He discreetly opened the note under the table and read the words. He glanced at Emily, who was already walking away among the guests as if nothing had happened. Deep in her eyes, he saw something he hadn't seen in a long time. Truth. During dinner, the music swelled, the toasts rang out, but Alexander remained silent. Helena, proud, noticed her husband's lack of enthusiasm. She glanced at him, expecting him to toast, to speak, to reaffirm his image as absolute lord. But Alexander merely raised his glass, unsmiling. His silence spoke louder than any words. This silence, repeated at every gala, every banquet, began to become a habit. Emily continued to leave hidden notes, short, almost enigmatic phrases. What we keep silent about condemns us, or the truth cannot be erased. Alexander read, folded the paper, and put it in his pocket. He never responded with words. He responded with silence, with fixed gazes that avoided getting lost in trivial conversations, with toasts without speech, leaving the room feeling uneasy. Little by little, the guests began to understand. It wasn't just distraction or boredom, it was something deeper. There was an invisible crack in that golden table. Helena sensed it too, her husband's increasingly distant gaze and his mysterious habit of touching his jacket pocket as if he were guarding a secret aroused a silent anger in her. He knew something was happening, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Emily, on the other side, felt the weight of her boldness. Each note was a risk, but also a hope. Hope that Alexander would finally see what lay before him, not just a maid, but someone who dared to show him a truth that his own wife hid beneath makeup and glamour. That night, when she collected the last glass and turned off the lights in the room, Emily knew she had begun something irreversible. The millionaire's silence wasn't empty. It was a promise. And deep down, she was certain that destiny was already beginning to move. The note routine began like lighting matches in fog, small flashes that don't illuminate the entire room but leave a true scent in the air. At each gala, Emily moved among the guests with the same discretion as always, but carrying a rectangle of paper, folded in 3 in her apron. The procession was choreographed, tray to the left, glass replaced, hand escaping for a second to the inside pocket of Alexander's jacket. Sometimes the message arrived in the early hours of the morning, pinned to the coat hanger of his blazer. Sometimes it appeared under the napkin, folded with military perfection. Listen to what they don't say. Respect is the luxury you can't buy. Pain has witnesses. Short sentences, sharp as glass, always unsigned, but imbued with the faint scent of the service corridor, the one no one notices when the music starts. Alexander learned to open the paper without moving a muscle in his face. He folded the edges with the same precision with which he signed contracts, then put it away. What changed came later. When the orchestra called for speeches, he responded with a silent toast. When he was provoked to discuss new investments amid polite laughter, he returned a curt good evening and an absent smile. When his wife touched his arm, demanding he resume the performance, he leaned his glass against the edge of the table and let the sound of the crystal do for him what words could not. Silence, a first shield, became a declaration. And like all meaningful declarations, it began to bother. Helena noticed the ritual before it became a rumor. At first, she was only surprised by the way he touched his pocket, as if checking a secret heartbeat. Then she noticed the same gesture repeated another night and another, until suspicion set in. The red dress seemed heavier, the hostess's smiles harder. She began to watch Emily with eagle eyes, studying the movements of her hands, the time she took. Between the table and the pantry, the way she approached behind the chair to adjust a napkin. She asked questions devoid of innocence. Who straightens the jacket? Who tucks the lapels? And when the answer didn't work, she responded with icy silence, the only one she knew. The orchestra sensed the change in the air. The maitre d', a veteran connoisseur of shipwrecks, lowered his instructions to the waiters. Even the lamps seemed to tremble as Emily passed, not out of fear, but out of foreboding. In the hallways, the invisible thread between the young woman and the billionaire stretched to the point of snapping. One night, between dessert and liqueurs, a note got stuck in the lining of his suit and nearly fell onto the carpet. Alexander caught it in the reflection and hid it in his palm. What we keep silent about condemns us, while Helena, 2 seats away, glared at the gesture with the fury of someone who'd just seen a crack in the throne. In the following days, his wife's wounded vanity traded the refined game for open surveillance. She ordered the flowers in the pantry replaced with taller arrangements, allowing her to see who entered and left from afar. Repositioned staff on the main staircase to speed up the flow, but in reality, to monitor footsteps. ordered the tailor to retrieve her husband's suits directly from the closet, trying to track the path of the pockets. And, with the polished cruelty that characterized her, she began to scribble new little humiliations. Asking Emily to serve the same guest twice so that he would cross her field of vision. Loudly correcting the distance between the glass and plate, suggesting with poisoned sweetness that some people are too well written for those who should only be polishing. Emily absorbed the blows like someone learning to breathe underwater. Her face didn't harden, but it took on a resilient contour. He knew his tickets were matches in the fog, and that if anyone took them, they would try to use them as bait. So he pared down his words even further. On a rainy night, the message fit into 2 lines. I saw, and I haven't forgotten. Alexander read it as the orchestra attacked an old pattern. For the first time, he looked up from the paper and met hers reflected in the polished metal of a candlestick. They didn't smile. They simply recognized each other. His silence began to have a rhythm. When he agreed with something, he would touch the tip of his index finger to the bowl before drinking. When he disagreed, he would swirl the glass on the table without raising it to his mouth. When Helena's presence demanded a spectacle, he would accept the role for a minute, then return it to the empty stage. Society, trained to hear applause, began to hear the interval between clapping as well. And it was during this interval that rumors flourished, that the master of the house was thinking differently than he was saying, that the lady, despite her brilliance, was no longer reflective, that a young woman in a short uniform and a wide-eyed gaze was unknowingly changing the acoustics of those walls. On the last night of the cycle, before everything fell apart, Emily left the note with hands colder than marble. When words fail, karma speaks. Alexander folded the paper with the delicacy of someone closing a bedside book, and instead of putting it away, placed it in his outer jacket pocket, visible as a handkerchief. He said nothing. The gesture, however, spoke volumes. Helena saw it, and, seeing it, she decided that vigilance was no longer enough. It was time to be silent. Little did she know that by tightening the noose of her own trap, she was summoning to the table the only force unimpressed by dresses or chandeliers, the exact time of return. With each new gala night, the ritual repeated itself. Emily, in her short, youthful uniform that seemed at odds with the sophisticated attire around her, walked between the tables and chairs like a discreet shadow. Her steady hands balanced glasses and plates, but the true weight she carried were the small pieces of paper folded in 3, hidden in her apron. Each note was a fragment of courage, short, sharp sentences, capable of piercing the crystal walls that sustained the house's lies. Silence becomes poison. Silence also speaks. I saw. Simple words, but they burned in Alexander's inner jacket pocket more than any speech. He read them silently, sometimes with a slight movement of his fingers under the tablecloth, other times during a waltz break, when everyone was distracted by the music. He guarded the papers with the same seriousness with which he signed million-dollar contracts. He didn't respond with notes. His response came in gestures, brief toasts, fixed glances, the discomfort of not giving in to the dinner party's drama. His silence became so eloquent that it began to annoy the guests, accustomed to his host's words. Helena, his wife, was the first to feel something slipping through her fingers. She watched every gesture, and the more she saw her husband silent, the more suspicious she became. At that golden table, where everything should have shone, a shadow was growing between them. She still didn't understand where it came from, but his increasingly distant gaze betrayed the existence of something invisible, and her anger grew accordingly. Over time, Helena's wounded vanity turned into an obsession. She began to watch Emily's every move. She noticed how long it took her to cross the room, the way she walked close to her husband, even the way she folded her napkin on his lap. Every detail seemed suspicious, every gesture interpreted as an affront. In the silence of the early morning, Helena would vent to herself in front of the mirror. I'll find out. Meanwhile, Emily lived on a razor's edge. She knew her boss was watching her, knew each note was a risk, but she wouldn't stop. Leaving those papers was her way of existing, of making her presence felt in a world that insisted on treating her as invisible. It was as if each note were a seed planted, destined to germinate at the right moment. She wasn't seeking romance or immediate recognition. She sought only the silent justice she believed would one day come. Alexander silently fueled his own conflict. The notes were barbs, but also compasses. They showed him the truth he avoided facing. He still lacked the courage to face Helena, nor to break the social mask that sustained his marriage. But at each dinner, his silence grew heavier. It was no longer a mission, it was resistance. And everyone at the table, including his wife, began to notice. The orchestra continued playing, the guests toasted, but the real music that rocked the house were those short phrases hidden in pockets. And Helena, increasingly wounded in her vanity, felt the need to react. And when vanity is wounded, it turns to poison. Helena didn't need proof to act. The shadow of suspicion was enough. And the shadow that hung over her came from her husband's increasingly distant eyes and his silence at gala dinners. He was no longer the eloquent host who toasted with long, elegant speeches. Now Alexander simply raised his glass without a smile, and this cold gesture fueled rumors that spread like poison among the tables. For Helena, there was a clear reason for the change. Emily. Determined to crush any trace of boldness, Helena began to plot public humiliations for the maid. The first blow was subtle. During an intimate dinner, in front of a few close friends, she deliberately dropped a crystal glass on the expensive carpet. The crack echoed through the room, and before anyone could react, Helena pointed at Emily. "Be more careful, you clumsy girl." The guests glanced at each other uncomfortably. They knew it wasn't the young woman's fault, but none of them dared contradict the hostess. Emily, head bowed, picked up the shards with trembling hands, her eyes teary but steady. Days later, a second humiliation surfaced. Helena asked Emily to pour the winery's most expensive wine. As the young woman approached, carefully holding the bottle, Helena deliberately tilted the glass, causing the liquid to drip onto the linen tablecloth. "Incompetence has its limits," he said loudly, making sure everyone at the table heard. Emily wanted to respond but held back. It was just another blow in a silent war she knew she couldn't win with the power of words. Alexander watched it all in silence. But inside him, something was beginning to crack. With each unfounded accusation, each humiliation, he felt his chest burn with the shame of his omission. Emily's notes in his pockets weighed more than jewelry. What we keep silent condemns us. The truth cannot be erased. Short sentences, but now they hammered at his conscience. He could no longer pretend not to see. In the pantry, far from his mistress's eyes, Alexander approached Emily one night when she was washing glasses alone. He handed her a handkerchief, as if it were merely a gesture of kindness, and murmured, "You don't deserve this." Emily looked up, surprised. She didn't respond, but in that instant she understood that her silence was no longer just pain. It was a weapon. And Alexander, without even admitting it, was already on her side. Helena, however, was not mistaken. She noticed every exchange of glances, every restrained gesture, every second of her husband's silence. And it was in this silence that she sensed her defeat. But instead of retreating, she decided to intensify the cruel game even further. To her, Emily was not just a maid, she was an enemy to be destroyed. Fate, however, does not allow injustices to go unanswered. What Helena saw as triumph was nothing more than an invisible trap set by karma. And with each veiled slap, each cruel word, the rope stretched tighter, until the inevitable moment when it would snap. Helena was no longer content to observe. Her husband's silence at dinner, the mysterious notes that seemed to burn in Alexander's pockets, Emily's silent resistance, all of it corroded her like rust on gilded iron. It was no longer enough to ridicule the maid in public. Now she needed to destroy the young woman definitively, irreversibly. Locked in her room, before the mirror surrounded by jewelry and perfume, Helena rehearsed her next move. She held a diamond necklace she had inherited from her mother, a valuable piece, not only in price but in symbolism. She observed it for long minutes, until with the coolness of someone moving pieces on a chessboard, She hid it in Emily's apron as she passed through the hallway carrying clean towels. A quick, almost imperceptible gesture, but enough to turn a life into ruin. That evening, the hall was full. Important guests were gathering for another dinner. The orchestra played softly, and the clinking of cutlery served as background music for the conversations. Helena stood up suddenly, her eyes burning, her hand on her chest. "My mother's necklace is missing." The words echoed through the room like thunder. The murmur grew louder, everyone looked around, and Alexander looked up in surprise. Helena wasted no time. With a cruel smile, she ordered, "Search. Start with the maid's room." Emily, paralyzed, dropped the tray on the floor. Her teary eyes scanned the room, searching for some explanation, but no words came. A few minutes later, 2 security guards returned with the necklace in hand. Shock rippled through the room. "I would." "Never touch that," Emily pleaded, her voice breaking. But the venom had already spread. Guests whispered, some shaking their heads in disapproval, others just watching coldly. Helena, triumphant, placed her hand on Alexander's shoulder and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Now you see who she really is." But Alexander's gaze didn't turn to his wife. It was fixed on Emily. There was something wrong with the scene. The way the necklace was folded, as if it had been put on in a hurry. The genuine desperation in the young woman's eyes, so different from Helena's flawless performance. Alexander said nothing. He just took a deep breath, clenched his fists, and remained silent. Emily then raised her tear-filled eyes to him. She didn't ask for help, didn't plead. She simply let a tear fall and murmured almost inaudibly, "The truth always comes out." Her words hung in the air, simple, yet heavy as a sentence. Helena smiled, convinced she had won. But in that arrogant smile, she was signing her own conviction. Because although Emily had lost the battle in front of everyone, fate was already plotting a turnaround. And Alexander, silent, guarded every detail like a judge in waiting. Calmer, patient, was about to take the next step. The mansion seemed to be buzzing with rumors. The story of the necklace found in Emily's drawer was already circulating in whispers among the servants, and even more quickly, among the social circles that frequented Helena and Alexander's dinners. What seemed to the mistress to be her definitive victory soon turned into doubt. Some had noticed the haste with which she had handled the accusation, the almost triumphant smile when the necklace was discovered, and even the theatrical way she had described her pain. The rumors spread like cracks in expensive glass, invisible from afar, but inevitable up close. Alexander, though silent at the time of the accusation, couldn't erase from his memory Emily's tearful eyes, maintaining her dignity even in the face of shame. That wasn't a look of guilt, it was a look of wounded innocence, and that memory haunted him at every meeting, every night. At the business table, when partners asked for his opinions, he saw her image picking up the shards of glass, enduring insults without response. The silence that had been her protection now became a suffocating prison. Gradually, guests present that night began to talk among themselves. Some whispered that the necklace seemed poorly hidden. Others claimed to have seen Helena in the hallways moments before her supposed disappearance. Small contradictions emerged, and with them, the image of the perfect wife began to crumble. Helena, however, ignored the signs. She smiled at dinners, organized get-togethers, believing she still controlled the narrative. She didn't realize that the more she showed off, the more she fueled suspicion. Emily, now removed from her most important duties, limited herself to working silently behind the scenes of the house. But her calm expression and upright posture made her a silent symbol of resistance. She didn't need to speak. Every glance she exchanged with the other employees was enough to sow doubts about the official version. Marta, the housekeeper in particular, began to observe her closely. She had known Helena for years and knew the lengths to which her employer would go when she felt threatened, and she also knew that the necklace hadn't appeared there by chance. One night, Alexander entered the library to find one of the notes forgotten on his desk. Emily hadn't handed it to him directly. It had probably fallen from a jacket. The words, once again, were short and to the point. "The truth always finds a way." He held the paper between his fingers as if it were a confession. He took a deep breath and felt for the first time that he could no longer remain neutral. Silence was no longer an answer. It was transforming him into an accomplice. Meanwhile, Helena was receiving clear signs that her act was failing. An invitation to an important event was forgotten. A close friend stopped seeing her, and even the social media, which had previously praised her dresses and parties, now mentioned her less. The isolation was beginning to take its toll, and instead of reflecting, she sank deeper into her arrogance, convinced she would need to act again to silence any threat. But Alexander was already moving in another direction. He discreetly requested access to the house's internal recordings, spoke with Marta, and began to piece together the loose ends Helena had believed invisible. In his heart, there was not only indignation at Emily's suffering, there was also the seed of something more, the need to make amends. Fate silently prepared the twist, and when it arrived, no one could pretend they hadn't seen it. Alexander didn't sleep that night. The image of Emily, accused in front of everyone, came back in flashes every time she closed her eyes. The memory of the necklace found as fabricated evidence haunted him. The way Helena had smiled throughout the scene sounded more like an act than genuine indignation. Sitting on the edge of the bed, he watched his wife sleep with the tranquility of someone who believes they've won. But inside him, something no longer allowed him to rest. The next morning, Alexander found her in the main hall. Helena, draped in silk, was arranging flowers in a crystal vase when he broke the silence. "Where were you?" "Before you accused Emily," he asked, his voice firm. Helena looked up, surprised by her husband's boldness. She replied ironically, "Is that so, Alexander? Are you going to doubt your wife because of a maid?" But the sentence, laced with contempt, only reinforced the suspicion he already harbored. He didn't respond. He simply stared at her, with the weight of someone no longer fooled. His silence this time wasn't an omission, it was a challenge. Helena looked away first, realizing that, perhaps, for the first time, control was slipping from her grasp. That afternoon, Alexander left the mansion without warning. He asked the driver to take him to a simple neighborhood, far from the marble corridors and golden lights of gala dinners. He had discovered where Emily had retreated after her humiliation. He found her in a small cafe, setting tables with the same discipline she once used to polish crystal. When she saw him, she froze. The tray nearly slipped from her hands. "What are you doing?" "Here," he asked, his voice low, his eyes teary. Alexander took a deep breath. He was no longer the man of calculated gestures. He was someone carrying guilt and urgency. "I'm here because I made a mistake. I shouldn't have let that happen." Emily lowered her eyes, unsure if she believed it. The pain was still too fresh, but his tone wasn't one of convenience. It was genuine. "You won't stop," she murmured. "Maybe not," he replied. "But I will." There was silence. They looked at each other, and in that instant, Emily realized that the silence he carried at dinner wasn't empty. It was a choice. It was resistance. He hadn't spoken because he was trying to learn to listen and to hear somehow what she said in the notes. Alexander placed one of the papers he had saved on the table. It contained the sentence that had been haunting him. "The truth always finds a way." "I want to find that way," he said. Emily took a deep breath. There was no overt romance, no easy promises. There was only the naked truth, and she had always known it would come one day. "Then start by looking inside your own home," he replied. Back at the mansion, Helena tried to maintain her facade, but every ignored phone call, every missed invitation, every sidelong glance at social events was a reflection of a reputation that was beginning to crumble. She still believed she could rebuild her image, but she didn't realize that what was crumbling wasn't just external. It was the trust within the very walls of the house. That night, Alexander didn't sit at the head of dinner. He remained standing, watching his wife fake smiles, and for the first time he felt ready to speak. The silence that had protected him until then was about to become a voice. The following nights were marked by awkward silences, not only in the mansion, but also in the Manhattan ballrooms where Helena had previously reigned as an impeccable hostess. The stolen necklace had already become a rumor, and the rumors, increasingly sharper versions. Some whispered that their mistress had made it all up. Others insinuated that Alexander no longer had control over his own household. What everyone could see was the growing crack in the perfect facade Helena had so carefully cultivated. Invitations began to thin out. Dinners that were once sought after began to take place without Helena's name on the guest list. Close friends avoided calling, and even society magazines, which loved to photograph her exuberant dresses, now mentioned her less. Each absence was a blow, and each blow wounded the pride she wore like a crown. Helena, however, did not give up. She told herself that she still owned the narrative, but every sideways glance in the elite corridors said otherwise. Inside the mansion, the dynamic was also beginning to shift. Alexander no longer hid his protectiveness toward Emily. During a private dinner, when Helena once again tried to ridicule the maid for a supposed mistake in the service, Alexander interrupted his wife with a simple, "It's perfect. Thank you, Emily." The phrase, spoken in a firm voice, echoed like a sentence. Helena swallowed hard, her eyes flashing, but she didn't dare respond in front of everyone present. This gesture, though small, carried immense weight. The other servants noticed. The young woman who until recently had been the target of humiliation now became a protected figure. Looks that had been filled with pity now turned to respect. Marta, the housekeeper, whispered to Emily one night, "His silence is changing sides." And Emily, though she feared the consequences, felt for the first time a breath of hope. Helena, on the other hand, felt increasingly isolated. The house no longer responded to her orders with the same fear. Even the guests, who had always aligned themselves with her power, now hesitated to agree with her words. Emily's presence, standing dignified in every corner of the house, became a living reminder of the injustice. And Alexander, growing ever more assertive, transformed the silence that had once been a prison into a shield for the maid. One rainy night, Emily was in the garage cleaning her neon-green Lamborghini. Alexander entered silently, watching her from afar. He approached and said softly, "You're not alone." Emily looked up in surprise. She didn't answer, but in that instant she understood something had changed. He was no longer just a man torn between his wife's vanity and compassion for his maid. He was someone willing to take a stand. Helena, who had been watching hidden behind the glass door, clenched her fists until her knuckles turned white. The rage consuming her wasn't just jealousy, it was fear of what she couldn't control, the dignity that neither the slap nor the accusation nor the venom had destroyed. And it was in this fear that she decided she wasn't finished yet. The next blow would be the cruelest. But fate was already sharpening its blade, ready to give each person exactly what they deserved. Helena's wounded pride knew no bounds. The social isolation, the invitations that no longer arrived, the sidelong glances even among the servants, all of it gnawed at her. Deep down, she knew her image as the perfect wife had been shattered, but she refused to admit defeat. If she couldn't win with words or acting, she would seek Emily's ultimate ruin. In Helena's twisted mind, it wasn't enough to drive the young woman from the house. She had to destroy her so completely that not even Alexander would dare think of defending her. One afternoon, she locked herself in her room and devised a cruel plan. She would pretend Emily had tried to poison her. All it would take was a glass of spiked wine, a dramatic performance in front of the right guests, and the maid would not only be humiliated, but also expelled as a criminal. Helena believed that if she turned everyone against Emily, Alexander would have no choice. She carefully prepared the scene, discreetly instructing one of the waiters to bring a tray at the appointed time and leaving the reserved glass on the table. That night the hall was brighter than usual. It was a final gamble, and she knew it. Emily entered with the tray of glasses, her uniform impeccable, the serene eyes of someone who had learned to face pain without hesitation. Alexander, sitting at the head of the table, watched her every move, already suspicious of his wife's every gesture. It was then that Helena, in front of everyone, raised her voice. "Strange, this wine tastes bitter." The comment echoed like a sentence. All eyes fell on Emily, who stood still, her heart racing. But fate, ever precise, intervened. Marta, the housekeeper, immediately approached and collected the glass. He took it to the pantry, where a guest sommelier was discreetly analyzing the drinks. Minutes later, he returned with the answer that silenced the room. The glass had been tampered with before the tray was delivered. Everyone's eyes turned to Helena. The carefully laid plan had fallen apart in front of witnesses. Alexander stood. The rage he'd held back for months now shone in his eyes. "How many more times will you try to destroy an innocent person to protect your pride?" he said loudly, firmly, making sure every guest heard. The silence that followed was devastating. Helena tried to laugh, tried to feign surprise, but the weight of the truth was already bearing down on her like a stone. Emily, standing, didn't need to say anything. Her dignity was her defense. The guests, previously hesitant, now whispered with conviction. The wife had lost her mind. The mask had fallen before everyone. Helena retreated, but there was no longer room for disguise. Karma, silent and relentless, exacted its toll. The woman who believed she controlled destinies was now a prisoner of her own trap. That night, Alexander didn't just defend Emily. He began rewriting history in front of everyone. And the house, which had so often been the scene of humiliation, now bore witness to a truth that could no longer be kept silent. The mansion's dining room was silent that night, unlike any other. The lit chandeliers illuminated more than the plates and glasses. They revealed invisible cracks in the masks that for years had sustained a farce. Helena entered with her usual poise, her red dress like armor, but her eyes betrayed the wear and tear. There was no longer an audience applauding her performances. The guests, once so numerous, were now few and wary. The emptiness around her screamed louder than words. Alexander sat at the table, motionless, one of Emily's notes between his fingers. It wasn't just a piece of paper, but a testament to everything he had endured in silence. The truth always finds a way. When he finally looked up, he stared at his wife. His voice wasn't shouted, but firm, full of determination. "This is the last dinner this house will be the scene of lies." The words echoed through the room, making Helena shiver. Emily, who stood at the back of the room, her short, low-cut uniform impeccable, felt her heart race. She hadn't expected him to speak in front of everyone. Alexander continued, "There was accusation, there was humiliation, there was venom, but none of that destroyed the truth, because silence speaks, and today I speak for it." The guests exchanged glances, murmuring. Marta, the housekeeper, appeared with a small envelope. Inside were the camera recordings confirming Helena's movements before. The alleged theft of the necklace, evidence that sealed her guilt. Helena paled. She tried to justify herself, but the words stuck in her throat. Her perfect mask of exemplary wife fell before everyone. Emily didn't celebrate. Her eyes welled up, but not with triumph. They were tears of relief. Karma, silent and patient, was finally doing its job. Helena, defeated, left the room with hurried steps. The mansion gate closed behind her like a sentence. Alexander stood and walked toward Emily. There was no touch, no promise of forbidden romance. Just a firm look and a simple request. "Thank you for not giving in." Emily took a deep breath, her dignity intact, and replied calmly, "Justice never rushes, but it always arrives." That night, the mansion was no longer a stage for humiliation, but for redemption. Fate had given each man what he deserved. His wife, solitude, the millionaire, the lesson that silence can be prison or liberation, and Emily, the symbolic victory of standing tall, even when all seemed lost. And so, as the chandeliers went out and the city slept outside, the echo of that phrase seemed engraved on the walls. What we keep silent about condemns us, but the truth always finds a way. If this story touched you, leave a like, subscribe to the channel and comment. Fate always takes its toll. The next video will be even more exciting. See you next time.